this down. So after class today, actually, I can't remember if I might have put it up there yesterday. So let's check real quick before I say this and don't say something wrong. Yeah. So after class today, under assignments, you'll have kind of an online quiz, but you also have kind of the first homework assignment. So the due date won't be for quite a while, kind of 2 weeks from today. So you have quite a bit of time to work on it. Probably after we get done with today's class, for sure Thursday's class, we'll have covered everything that will be on that assignment. So you could start working on the first few problems, and we've already covered that. But some of the later questions you might want to wait for today's or Thursday's discussion. Okay. Any questions for me before we kind of get started here today? I also have posted the paper I want you to read for this week. So this week we're just going to have one. We're going to focus on this one right here. So we'll kind of discuss this on Thursday. Having an idea about what it's going to talk about allows us to kind of take the time in class and spend a little bit more time talking about regression, how we interpret the results, and start to get an idea about what you can do on that project. Okay. So let's get going here. So we left off kind of last class. I showed you some of the numbers about the different leagues, kind of the teams that were the highest valued. And we said we noticed, at the top, we saw a lot of these large market teams, right, or these big cities. So I'll use this terminology a lot, small versus large market. And really what we're referring to there is the large market teams just face a higher demand curve. That could come from a higher number of people. That could come from, a larger percent of the people in that city having higher incomes. Whatever is going to kind of, all these things that we think impact demand. But, probably the easiest way to think about it is population. It's pretty highly correlated with, how much demand there is with the population in the city. And we talked about kind of how we decide the optimal number of wins. So we'll review that a little bit as we start to get into some more subjects here today. But we saw that, if these large market teams face this higher demand curve, and if both teams are profit maximizing or both teams are win maximizing, that large market team is always going to have the advantage. Okay. So I'll review that here in just a second and talk about, well, what happens if we have a mix of the two? What if small market teams are win maximizing? What if large market teams are profit maximizing? Okay. So does the city size kind of affect all leagues the same, right? Well, we can think about, there's certain leagues that probably have a lot less variation in revenue. If we think about differences across the leagues, there's a lot of cities that have an NHL team that don't have any other professional sports team, right? So maybe some certain, some sports, right, that are going to be less impacted because the cities where there is high demand for those sports, may not be the same for, the other leagues. So you can imagine, I'm not a big hockey guy. What's a city? Maybe Vancouver, right? They're going to have an NHL team, but the demand might not be there for NFL football, right? And so it's going to vary depending on which league we're looking at, and it won't simply be dictated by city size. So the NHL is a good example where they have a lot of smaller markets or places we would think are smaller markets, but they're Canadian cities where there's just overall higher demand, if we look at kind of per person, than even there would be in maybe something like, Chicago. Right? Chicago is probably a bad example there, but Dallas or something like that. So if we look just at kind of a statistic that measures kind of the range of valuations we see, so are there some leagues where the large market teams are way higher than the small market teams, right, in terms of their valuation? Well, we kind of see that the NHL here, the range is just showing us the difference between the maximum and the minimum. And that's a lot smaller in the NHL than it is in the NFL or the other leagues, right? So we see that there is some variation. And, depending on what league we're looking at, we might want to think about what factors might be driving some of this difference. Okay? So, let's initially look at some of the differences across the leagues. We'll then dive into today really the sources of where a lot of this revenue is coming from. Okay, so that valuation is going to be driven primarily by that team's ability to earn high revenues, right? So where are those revenue sources coming from? So just looking at the differences though, if we were to look at the revenue, reported revenue, or kind of the operating income of every single team, we just focus on operating income. There's, the average is 74 million, and we didn't see a single team. I think this was 2018 was the data that I had. There wasn't a single team that lost money that year, or on the books, there was no team that had kind of a negative profit value. Right? We're just looking at the difference between their reported revenues and the reported costs. We look at Major League Baseball, slightly lower average operating income, and we had a few teams there that were on the books losing money. Okay? Now, in any one year, we might see a team report a negative profit, but right, this is more than just a one-year game. This is the team's thinking about operating for theoretically in perpetuity, right? So we can experience negative profits today as long as we're earning positive profits in the future. Or we had positive profits in the years prior. The NHL, I didn't put kind of that, just for the sake of keeping things on this slide. We see the NHL has quite a few more teams that are operating, at least on the books, with a negative accounting profit, and the NBA has kind of 2 teams here. And this varies year to year. The teams that might be switching in and out of this depending on kind of the contracts they've given the players, or relocating fees or something like that they have to pay. So this isn't a perfect measure, but we can see that based off of just the accounting profits, costs and revenues here, and the costs that we see reported, and we'll talk about this in a second here, they only reflect kind of explicit costs, right? They don't factor in opportunity costs, right? So this is simply accounting profits here. So if we want to focus on revenues, right, what's driving the variation that we see in these teams' revenues, or even the variation we see across leagues? Okay? So there's a couple different sources. The easiest one we've already kind of talked about, is ticket revenue, right? Or you see it sometimes called as gate receipts or gate revenue. This is essentially how much money the team is making from ticket sales, right? And this is just ticket sales. This could be luxury box, whatever, some of these, different types of tickets, but just we added them all up. And I'll use this, as the revenue from gate receipts, right? So R with a subscript G. And, this notation isn't the most important thing, so don't get too caught up on that. We're also going to have revenue that comes from broadcasting rights, right? A lot of the times this is done through the league, right? But occasionally we see situations where individual teams will sell the rights to kind of put on their games on a certain TV network, right? Or even potentially radio stations. Right? So they might have deals that they've made with CBS or ESPN, where they're getting, ESPN's paying them to be able to put their game on TV. Like I said, a lot of the times this doesn't come from the individual team. It comes from the league, or if we look at college kind of conferences. But we'll discuss that kind of a little bit later on. But that is another source of revenue. Licensing income. So this is things like apparel, companies paying the NFL or paying the NBA, paying certain teams to use their logos, because they are trademarked, so they can kind of generate some revenue through this. Venue revenue. So this is things like concessions. You might think relative to some of these other things, the concessions might not be a huge thing. But another thing that we factor into venue revenues are naming rights, right? So almost every stadium, there's some examples that you can find where it's not the case. But a lot of stadiums are like, AT&T Stadium, right? Or some company has purchased the rights to be able to put their name on that stadium, and then it's kind of just like marketing, right? It's advertising that company every time that team plays a game or that stadium is mentioned. League transfers, which I'm thinking we'll get to today, if not for sure on Thursday. But certain leagues have, they might, if we haven't talked about it yet, so I don't want to go too far into the weeds, but they might tell teams, well, look, we realize there's differences in large and small markets, so we're going to tax you essentially 50% of your gate revenues. And then once we collect that from every single team, then we'll kind of hand it out equally to each team. And we'll discuss later on how that helps maybe improve kind of the competition within that league. So we'll call these league transfers, right? Some of this revenue sharing that's then given back to these teams. So, we want to think about what total revenue is. We could almost think about it breaking it down to these 5 categories. If you really wanted to get real crazy with it, you could break these down even further, but these are the main ones that we'll think about. And they each kind of present different issues, right, to the team. Okay? So we've already talked about kind of deciding or being able to use our knowledge about the ticket market to determine equilibrium prices, equilibrium quantities. And so, that's going to help us identify what total gate revenue would be. If we can, look at the prices of tickets, the number of tickets sold, price times quantity, it's pretty easy to determine what the gate revenue is for each of these different teams or your different leagues, right? So I think I left out Major League Baseball here, although it probably would be true for them as well. I think I was just kind of probably typing quick and then forgot to add them in. But we don't see as much, oh, come on. All right, there we go. Our screen went out in class. So we don't see as much variation in gate revenue. If you look at stadium size, it does vary from team to team, but especially at the professional level, it's not wildly different. If you look at a stadium, and for basketball, if you look at, I don't even know if it's still called the United Center in Chicago versus Madison Square Garden, there are differences, but it's not like one has 10,000 seats and one has 80,000, right? It's a lot more consistent in terms of the stadium capacity. There's a little more variation in Major League Baseball, but I could say you could probably even still consider it a fairly low variation there, gate revenue. If we look at some of the highs here, New York's making 130, while the kind of the top NHL team is making 104, right? So, this is comparing kind of basketball to hockey. What's something that a lot of basketball and hockey teams actually do? Yeah, they share the same stadium. So a lot of these, there's a lot of stadiums that are getting used in multiple leagues, and that's why we don't see as much variation. We've got the same stadium capacity. Now, some of the variation might exist, so then why would we see lower gate revenue for the NHL team as opposed to the NBA team? And I can't remember if this is the case in New York, but let's assume they use the same stadium. Why might you still see the NHL team have lower gate revenue? They've got the same number of seats that they can sell. It's not just quantity that matters. What else matters? Yeah, interest in buying the ticket, which influences the ability and willingness to pay, which is our demand curve, right? So if our demand curve is lower, we still could even sell the same number of seats, but demand is lower, so we would sell them at a lower price, right? Price times quantity is our revenue for gate revenue. So that's why we might see that even if they can still sell out, the prices might be lower, right? And this happens a lot. We'll dive into some more discrimination issues as we get later on into the course. But if we're ever comparing leagues across genders or something like that, we don't just want to look at quantity to see if there's some kind of discrimination. We also want to look at price, right? Price times quantity is what matters. Okay? So there is more variation in Major League Baseball. If we look at kind of the highest earner compared to the lowest, and this isn't necessarily being driven by stadium capacity. A lot of this is being driven by that demand curve being lower, right? And there being a much lower price to attend a Tampa Bay Rays game as opposed to a New York Yankees game. Okay? If we look at the NFL, prices are actually fairly comparable, a lot more comparable across these teams as opposed to these Major League Baseball teams. Okay? But if we look at kind of the average revenue, it's very similar across the league. There's just a lot more variation in the Major League Baseball. Okay. So just looking at some of the numbers here and thinking about some of the issues that we might face. So we already talked about this. Oops, not revenue sharing yet. But quantity matters. So stadium capacity, prices matter, right? In factoring how much revenue is being made. And if we're going to compare across leagues, well, then the number of games matter, right? If we looked at the gate revenue for one game in baseball relative to football, it's going to be significantly lower. But why could it possibly be that a baseball team, even with lower revenue for each game, end up with higher total gate revenue. I guess it somewhat requires you knowing something about baseball and football. Yeah, right. Baseball, Major League Baseball, there's 162 games. So you factor that, 81 home games. And then at the NFL, we have a 16-game season. There's only 8 home games, right? So, yeah, if we don't earn, if we don't sell a lot more tickets at a much higher price in the NFL, we're not going to be able to compete with Major League Baseball's total gate revenue, right? Because they just play so many more games, right? Any questions up to this point? I think this stuff is, like I said, I'm kind of just building a scenario or building us up here. Now, we do have revenue sharing that potentially kind of eats into these gate revenues, right? So a lot of teams, there's different rules, and we won't, just kind of go with one. We'll just think about how they would all work. The NFL says, here you get to keep 60% of your gate revenue, but then 40% of it goes to the league. Once they collect 40% from every team, they split it out equally. So whatever the league gets from every single team, they divide it by 32 and give it back to the teams, right? MLB, teams get to keep 69%, and the rest of it kind of goes to the league, and then they kind of give it all back out. And they do some other revenue sharing in terms of local broadcast deals. They'll take a little bit of that as well. I can't remember the exact percent there, but it would operate in the same manner. Right? We're not focused too much on the numbers, just how this revenue sharing is going to affect these teams. And we'll break that down here later on today. And the NHL just has a bunch of complex rules. If you're really interested, you can Google them and dive in. But essentially, they do have a system that is set up to where teams are paying a certain percent of their gate revenue. I think in the NHL, it varies a little bit where they take different percentages of like luxury suites versus regular tickets, but also a certain percent of like concession sales. So it's just a little bit more complex, right? But they'll all operate in the same way once we get there. So we'll break down how revenue sharing kind of affects these teams a little bit later on. We'll go through some of these other revenue sources and mention kind of what we see going on there as well. So broadcast revenue, the NFL has only national contracts, right? So if you want to put on an NFL game, you have to go through the NFL. You don't go through the teams individually, right? The Indianapolis Colts aren't selling their games to CBS. The NFL is selling packages of games to CBS to be able to put on. Okay? One interesting thing we can think about, if I'm a league and I'm the only one that can sell these games. Well, if I just sell one block of games, I've got one product, right? And maybe that limits the demand that would exist for that one product, right? If I'm going to have to purchase the rights to put on every NFL game, well, you're talking about, only your top companies, CBS, NBC, they're the only ones that are even going to have, right? It's the ability and willingness. So they might want to, they have the willingness, but not many companies would have the ability to pay for every single NFL game, the broadcasting rights. So what they do is they start packaging these games, right? I don't know how familiar, the NFL is the best example, but how many, I don't know if you're familiar with the NFL, but there's games on CBS, there's games on Fox, there's games on ESPN, there's NFL Network. What they started to do is they started packaging these games. They started, okay, we'll sell the rights to Thursday night games. So then you have a lot more people who have the ability to pay for a smaller number of games there. You have them selling off the rights to, certain, they package, I think, the NFC differently than AFC games, right? So they start to break down this one huge product into multiple products so that there's more competition to be able to kind of drive up that price they're able to get from these broadcast companies, okay? I think I had some numbers here just because it's interesting to kind of think about what we're thinking here. So the most recent contract for Thursday night games was a 5-year deal. I forget the company who that's with. I should know this. I watch them, but I don't pay attention. It was a $3 billion deal. Right? So these are astronomical contracts, okay? If we go back and we look at the gate revenue, we're talking about annually 130 million. So multiply that by 5, we're still talking about what, 650 million there for the top team. Then we think about the NFL, 3 billion over 5 years, 3 billion divided by 32. These are, this broadcast revenue is a huge component in this total revenue. Okay. So $55 million per game. Obviously, if the NFL is doing these contracts, they kind of hand out the money then equally to all these teams that comes from these contracts. And I'm sure they keep a little bit of it for kind of operating expenses, but that's the general idea. So total broadcast revenue for the NFL in 2018 was $17 billion, right? So this was one of their products, right? Thursday night games, but all of their products that they packaged and sold made $17 billion, which is an astronomical amount for an annual revenue. That's only one of your 5 sources, right? Now, some of this money they kind of don't give back to the teams. There's also some collective bargaining agreements they've come up with where they give some of that money to the players as well. But still, the league there is still, what, $9 billion a year? I'd say that's pretty good, right? That's going to be a substantial portion of a team's revenue. So the owners and teams keep the other. See, it looks like I rounded it here probably. I guess the true deal is its true total is 16.8 billion, I guess, if we want to be real precise. We spread that over every team, 275 million every single year, right? So city size doesn't impact this, right? If you're a large or a small market team, you get the same amount from the league, okay? So what's this going to help do? If every team gets the same amount, think about the demand curve, right? And kind of the demand curve we talked about last class can represent average total revenue. So if this is one revenue source, what that's going to do is it helps alleviate this, concern that we have differences in small and large market teams. Because now this revenue isn't tied to whether or not they're small or large market. They're getting the same amount. Now gate revenue, that might be highly impacted by demand differences in small, large market teams. Because ticket revenue is coming from really where's that demand curve hitting your stadium capacity? Or is it below stadium capacity? So at least with allowing the league to be the only one to do these broadcast contracts, we get a nice even kind of revenue stream for each one of these teams. If we didn't allow, like if the NFL didn't do these contracts for every team, like they weren't the only one responsible, what do you think would likely happen? If I'm trying to put on games, right, and I'm a CBS or NBC, which teams am I going to want to buy the rights to first for their games? Yeah, the most popular, which are likely going to be coming from either high quality, but also you'll see it all the time. If you start thinking about this, start paying attention, especially in the NFL, where they have, what do they call it? There's Sunday night games. They'll like move kind of whatever game they think will bring in, have the highest demand. And a lot of times you'll be like, how is this the game they chose? But if you look at where the teams are located at, a lot of times you'll see New York teams, you'll see LA teams, you'll see these really, really large market teams, because even if they're not high quality, that's only one component into the demand, right? Quality likely increases the demand curve, but so does just the number of people who might be interested in watching that team play. So if we didn't allow the league to do this and let every individual team do it, well, now we've got an even wider difference in large and small market teams, because the large market teams are going to be able to sell all of their games at a higher price, whereas your smaller market teams are likely not going to be able to command that high of a price from these different broadcast networks. Okay. There's something else I wanted to say here. I thought there was. Like, give me 1 second. With revenue sharing. So I think maybe I have a slide for it. Yeah, maybe it's on here. I'll hold off on that thought because I think I might have a bullet for it here later. But it operates a little bit differently if we don't look at the NFL. We look at some of the other leagues. So Major League Baseball, right? They have national broadcast contracts that they do make with these huge broadcast networks, right? But it's not for every single game that's played, right? They still allow for some of these games. And we can look at the numbers here in just a second, but they also allow teams for the games that Major League Baseball doesn't sell that year, the team can sell the remaining games to local networks, right? So probably one of your best examples of this, I don't know if there's any Cubs fans, but back in the day, so WGN, right? Always had every single Cubs game that wasn't on one of these national networks that that Major League Baseball sold, okay? So they sell, right, these huge products. They sell 80 games to Fox or TBS or whoever, but they also allow teams of the remaining games to sell them to regional or local networks. Right? So what's the problem with this? Same problem that we had thinking about the NFL, right? The large market teams, yeah, if I go to a regional network in New York, right, there's going to be a much higher demand to purchase the rights to those games than there would be in Major League Baseball. It's a small market team. Tampa, right? Or pick your small market team. Why am I blanking? It's another good small market baseball team, smaller city. Well, back in the day when Montreal had a team, something like that, right? Just much smaller markets. Okay. Now, they did realize this is going to be an issue, right? And so any of these local deals that are made, there is some percent that has to be given back to Major League Baseball. So teams keep what would be 69% and share 31% back to the league. So it's not going to be as bad as if they let them keep all the money, right? They're getting some of that to share with everyone, but it's still relative to not allowing the teams to make these deals. It's still not going to drive that difference between small and large market teams. We could see local TV market deals. There's one in particular that's interesting in Major League Baseball I like to bring up here, which is TBS, which was Turner Broadcast Systems, who's owned, the person who owns TBS also owns the Atlanta Braves. And so basically, they were purchasing the rights to those Atlanta Braves games for guess what price? If I own the Braves and I own the company that wants to put the Braves games on, how much do you think I'm paying to put those games on? Nothing, right? Well, that's a problem because essentially they had, they're earning additional revenue, but guess what? Their costs are zero. So, that's a nice example of vertical integration where I'm selling the product to myself. I'm selling the rights to the games to my own network so I can keep the cost as low as possible. And I'm just going to basically do it for free, right? I mean, I don't have to pay anything. You can think of relating this to other markets. If we go back in time, there were a lot of companies who, maybe they own, the crude oil, they own the refineries and the distribution networks. So at every point, they can always pay like this lower cost, right? And then they pay a lower cost. That means they can provide it at a slightly lower price in the market and attract a lot more consumers because every other company has to actually pay, right, for the distribution or whatever it is. Okay. So that's something that's relatively interesting. And, we've already kind of discussed this. Each team is able to kind of put their own games on. We look at the actual differences, right? So we've got our LA teams, New York, Boston. Those are really the high local revenue teams. We go on the other end, Colorado, Miami, Tampa, right? Some of these smaller baseball markets, they're just basically hardly earning anything in their local broadcast deals. So this is going to cause kind of a little bit of a disparity between our large and small market teams, the fact that the Major League Baseball allows this, okay? Relative to like the NFL where they handle all of the broadcast deals, okay? And if we're just thinking about population, so I just did market size here, and we're looking at how is that correlated with how much local broadcast revenue these teams earn, there's a pretty strong positive correlation, right? So when I said that population isn't the only thing that matters, it's not, but it definitely is a really, really good indicator that that's going to be a large market team. Okay? So going through this stuff a little bit quick, because I know I want to spend a little more time drawing some stuff for you guys. The NBA and NHL, very similar to Major League Baseball. The only difference, so they have some national contracts with Fox or whoever the broadcast network is. They also allow local deals to be made, but for their local deals, they don't require any of the revenue to be shared. So at least Major League Baseball is trying to alleviate this concern. The NBA and NHL said we really don't care. Or maybe it's that they just don't believe there's as much variation how much local broadcast revenue those teams can make. Okay? So if we think about, would this make revenue more or less equitable across the teams? Well, less equitable, right? Because now your large market teams are going to get those local broadcast deals, but they don't have to share anything with the league. Okay? Let's look at just some of the numbers. When I said maybe they don't believe that there's variation, I don't know. That looks like pretty big variation to me, right? If you take the top local broadcast revenue team, the lowest, 150 versus 9 million, that's definitely going to put the Charlotte Hornets kind of behind the 8 ball there, right? Same thing with the NHL. Theirs isn't quite the disparity, right? But there's still a pretty big gap there between the highest and lowest team. Okay. Any questions or concern or anything? Yeah. For any local network? Yeah, so if you're thinking local network, that was a deal that was made, right? The local network deals are done through the teams. So all that revenue is this local broadcast revenue. Evenly across the teams? Are you talking about like a MLB TV thing, or are you talking? So that's going to be different. So MLB TV is to be completely, I'd have to look into it to know exactly how it works, but that is a league deal, right? That is Major League Baseball. So the revenue that goes there, I'm imagining they have a deal with the local companies and they share some of that revenue because, if you think about what they're doing, they're putting every single game on this streaming platform, but they allow these local broadcasts to also play at the same time. So they're giving the rights away. I'm sure they're paying them something. And whatever's paid to them, paid to Major League Baseball, I'm sure there's some deal made out. And so it would eat into some of the local broadcast revenues a little bit, but it's not going to be 100%. Right? It's not going to be 100% local or 100% kind of to the league. I want to say national, but it's not national, right? It's like the league level. I'd have to look into like exactly what the percent breakdown is there. But yeah, some of that's still going to go to local broadcast revenue, but not as much as probably prior to these streaming services. If you're this actually is a good, this sparks my thoughts. So if I'm a league, I kind of have to rely on these local broadcasts, right? Otherwise, I have to send my people out to every single game to be able to record the game and be able to upload it. So I am using them essentially. I'm going to have to end up paying them for their services. However, if I know that people are less likely to be watching their broadcast on TV and more likely to be watching on my streaming service, I don't have to pay them near as much, right? Because I know that without me, they're not going to get as many eyes on their product potentially. So, like I said, I'm sure there's a part of it's going to the league and a part of it's going kind of towards like local broadcast revenue. Exactly what that breakdown is, I don't know off the top. I'd have to look into it. Yeah, if I'm a league, if I did have the ability, so think of a good one here. So the Major League Baseball, right, has a ton of games, 162, 30 whatever teams. So it's going to be hard for them to get camera people out to every single game on their streaming service. So what's a league where a streaming service is very, very attractive because now essentially I've got vertical integration, right? I own all the rights to the games, but I also have my own streaming platform, which is essentially, think about it, that is your broadcast network. So if we look across different leagues, and I usually talk about these big four, but another one that I'll bring up a lot because it's a little bit different and it also brings up some good issues is think about something like the UFC, where they always have a camera crew, right? They're always able to get that. Well, I can put all those on my live streaming service. right? And it's no additional cost from what I would have to do otherwise. And I can sell it to myself at a price of zero, right? To put that game on. So streaming services make a lot of sense for a lot of leagues, but something like Major League Baseball, I think the reason why the broadcast is still technically coming on a local channel or network is because they just don't have the ability to send camera crews out to every single one of these games. And maybe they do. And I would imagine the costs have to be high. Otherwise, why wouldn't they just do that? And they wouldn't have to ever pay a local company. But yeah, kind of went off on a tangent there a little bit. But any other questions or thoughts? And sometimes some of the things we'll talk about in this class are really just general. We can get some discussion going on it because nothing's. We'll boil things down to kind of like the bare principles, but then the application, like there's a couple other like little wrinkles we'd have to kind of think about what would happen. So I think I might skip around today because I think this discussion, I want to come into this later. I'll just go over these real quick so I can get to drawing some stuff for you guys. So licensing revenue, I kind of mentioned what this is, but leagues will make deals so that companies can use player likenesses, team logos, and they'll pay the NFL for a fee to be able to use these, right? I think there was I feel like there was a big scandal or something with, I don't think it was Madden, but I think it was at the college level, where one of these video games had to then pay for players' likeness, right? So this is a decent source of revenue. Revenue sharing, once again, would help alleviate differences between large and small markets. It's more likely large markets can sell more apparel, right? Their logos or things might have more value. So there's a lot of revenue sharing that exists in this revenue stream as well. And then we see the NFL, although they don't allow local broadcast deals for the teams, they do allow teams to make their own licensing deals, right? So I think Cowboys have them with Nike and Pepsi. There's a couple other examples, but you can imagine now this is a source where you're going to see a larger gap driven between small and large market teams if you allow teams to have individual license deals as well, where it's the same way as kind of broadcasting. If we just look at some of the numbers out there, licensing revenue is still a pretty big number, 3.5 in the NFL, 5.5 baseball or Major League Baseball, NBA is 3.2. So your kind of main four leagues are generating quite a bit of money just through licensing. I thought some of these others were interesting. I was surprised they were that high. The one that this is insane to me, that Major League Soccer is still only at 420 million, but Ironman, this is like when people go out and run like 100 miles for fun, I guess. They're up at 300 million, which is pretty wild to me. The other one I wanted to mention here is the Players Association, just for their little logo and their this is kind of like the players' likenesses. That's actually not through the league. That's actually through the NFL Players Association, and so they're actually up there pretty high as well at 1.65 billion. Okay. So a lot of the things that we talked about, broadcast revenue, will kind of apply to licensing. I'm not going to quiz you on exactly what is the licensing revenue in this league versus that league. We just want to kind of discuss it a little bit. Venue revenue, parking, concessions, luxury boxes, different stadiums, even if they have the same capacity, one of them might have more kind of luxury boxes that people are willing to pay a higher price for. Okay? So that luxury suite or these, whatever you want to call them, luxury boxes, they might start to drive kind of larger differences in small market teams in terms of how much money can kind of be made. And so even though it's not, you could really argue that this should be ticket revenue, but a lot of the times the way they have these on the books, the luxury boxes or special seating, those kind of go in as venue revenue. Okay. There's not a ton of difference in pricing and concessions across these different teams or leagues. Signs or ads that you sell within the stadium, that's also kind of classified as venue. Naming rights is really a big one. And so we'll kind of look at that right now. We'll look at that in 1 second. But these naming rights are really going to be a very large part of this venue revenue. So, we see that even if we look at kind of luxury suites, there's quite a difference across NFL teams, and the NFL is a good one to bring this up. So we always think about this as the ability and willingness to pay. That's demand, right? So the ability to pay is really what's going to be driving a lot of these differences. So notice if we look at our top teams, we see our large markets, New York. We also see Seattle and San Francisco up there. Why do you think maybe they have really, really high revenue coming from luxury boxes? Yeah. Yeah, right. So you've got a tech industry really like right around San Francisco. And it's actually, I don't know if it's surprising, but if you look at the numbers, it's not individual people who are buying luxury boxes. It's usually companies, right? So nearby companies will purchase these luxury boxes and give tickets to employees, or the owner might be a fan, want to go to that. So a lot of these, we'll see some different cities up here that we didn't see when we looked at like the highest gate revenue earners. And that's really being driven by some of the companies in that area, right? Maybe that's why like Detroit's down here, right? A lot of the companies are gone now. And so you don't have near as much demand in Detroit for these luxury suites or these boxes. Okay. I put this link up here. If you want to, a little bit interested, you could dive a little bit deeper into this. We'll actually just pull it open here and just take a quick look. But they break this down. You kind of see the different industries that are more likely to purchase luxury suites. So the highest ones are attorneys and like kind of these legal, such and such at law, or these large law firms. Got a lot of banking industry. The banking industry has a lot of these luxury suites. So this is kind of an interesting article, and it kind of breaks down who's actually owning these luxury suites, and then think about it a little bit harder. So I just put that up as a resource if anyone's interested. The other one, part of venue revenue, is naming rights. Right? So they have an article as well that I think I have a link to here in just a second, where it really dives into these naming rights. So what's some of the numbers? So 6 NFL teams, and last I looked was 10 Major League Baseball teams that hadn't sold the rights to their stadium. Okay? So the rights, the stadium is just that the stadium is going to have your company's name associated with it. I guess technically, if I was rich enough, if I was Jeff Bezos, I could probably buy the naming rights and just call it Jeff Bezos Stadium. But for the most part, the people who actually have the money to pay for this are large companies. And the teams and the people that makes the most sense for are large companies. Because if I'm Jeff Bezos and I buy the naming rights, well, Jeff Bezos owns Amazon, but it's not really promoting his company per se. Right? Whereas if I'm Chase Bank, I have this huge cost to get the naming rights, but at least I can get some of that back, right? I have this huge cost, but I'm hoping that it generates more revenue than what it cost me, just from basically marketing, right? Hearing my name, people associating that team with my company. Yeah. They're all different. So that's some of them are really long. I don't know if I have any, we'll pull up in the article. I'm not sure if they mention any in particular, but yeah, they could be as short or as long as the team and company agree to, right? Now, more often than not, they're probably not going to be for a year or two, because then you're not, as a company, you're not going to get the most additional revenue out of that, right? It's not going to be as worthwhile to your company. It's not going to bring in as much additional revenue. But they are, I think if I remember some of them, right, they're usually like 10, 20 years, some of them. I'm sure there's some. Well, let's think about it this way. What teams do you think are more likely to be able to have shorter contracts? So, right, if we think about who wants what, the teams, let's just say if it's for the same price. If it's for the same price, the teams want a longer contract, right? Because they want to kind of lock in maybe these companies. But I said that backwards. The teams want the contracts as short as possible, right? So they could sell it every single year. The companies want it to be as long as possible because, well, yeah, if I'm going to pay for this thing, I want to make sure that I can really maximize the additional revenue that's coming in. And it might take some time for people to really start associating me with this team and kind of get this fan base to potentially start spending more on my product. And so you could think about there might be some differences in the contract length based off of market size there as well. So, and I mentioned here, there was one stadium that was trying, it's not like they weren't trying to sell their stadium name. So there's 6 NFL teams, 10 Major League Baseball teams. This could be driven that these teams just aren't good enough, don't have a high enough market size behind them, that there's no one who wants to buy the naming rights. But what's another potential reason why, if I'm a team, I might not want to sell the naming rights to my stadium, and why maybe there's more teams in Major League Baseball have done this than the NFL? Yeah. Yeah, if I have a stadium where the name is like synonymous with the team, there's been a reputation, there's some value to the team to have that stadium. What do you think could happen? The example I always go to is, because I think it's, there's a couple. You could mention probably Fenway in Boston, Wrigley, the Chicago Cubs Stadium, Lambeau Field's a good one in the NFL. But if some of these real historic stadiums and these teams who have been around for a long time, they sold the rights to their stadium, what do you think could happen to their demand curve? Potentially their fans revolt and they see it, right? So they're not selling the names to the rights because they know that there'd be a huge loss potentially in other revenue sources if they did that. And it makes a little more sense that we see that in Major League Baseball because the teams, on average, the league has just been around longer. You have a lot more of these historic stadiums where there may be this decrease in demand if they sold the rights. Okay? So I kind of mentioned that there. And there's some value to those rights. You could have kind of this revolt where fans feel like the team's selling out. Give some examples. The first naming rights were in 1973. Did I put the team here? I can't remember what team this was, but you kind of notice it was a very long contract, $37 million, pretty good amount of money. But if we look at the Golden State, they just sold theirs. It was at the average, it was somewhere between, it depended on the year. It was kind of a fluctuating thing where it built up. But every single year was somewhere between $15 and $20 million that Chase paid for the naming rights to that stadium, right? So this has been an increasing revenue source for a lot of teams. And then we got some other examples just to see some of the values, 17 and 19 million per year. The Dallas Cowboys, the exact specifics on some of these deals aren't really revealed. So I think when I was looking at this one, I couldn't find, there wasn't like public information about how long it actually was for. Maybe that's come out since then, but sometimes they kind of hide the exact amount. And then the LA Coliseum, they sold theirs for 16 years at 69 million. So this, or 69 billion, sorry. So there's a ton of money they kind of paid there. So, these teams buy the rights to these stadiums. We know that's a revenue source, but what's really interesting is, like, for these companies, is it worth it, right? These are astronomical amounts of money. Are you actually bringing in that much additional revenue? Because if you didn't, you were just doing it, I guess, for your own ego, right? So if we kind of compare this, we have this paper. So this is a PDF. We click on this link. Oh, come on. It's because I don't have. Let me see if I can copy and paste this. Oh, stop. I want to copy this. If I copy and paste this. I think it doesn't like that. We'll see if it, I might not like it. Maybe I'll pull that up next class. This is the main table that's important. You can kind of see all these companies that in recent times have purchased the rights to stadiums and how many of them are now bankrupt. Now, we're not saying that buying the naming rights caused them to go bankrupt, right? It could be that this was a last-ditch effort by these companies to not go bankrupt, right? They believe that there was going to be some additional gain. But what this paper really gets into is that when they tried to analyze the effects of buying the naming rights on a company's revenues, they actually can't find a statistically significant effect across all these different companies who have bought naming rights. So why do companies keep doing it? It's like a puzzle. It's like an economic puzzle as to why, even based off of all this historic data that we have, it doesn't show that buying these naming rights has any increase on your revenue. Why are teams still doing it? So it's a puzzle. There's no answer. I don't have an answer for it. I've tried to think through it. I think, as crazy as it sounds, I think some of it could be driven off of ego from some of these CEOs or kind of the owners of these different companies, but we really don't have any evidence to support that. It's hard to kind of get data on utility that some of these owners or these CEOs are getting just from having their company associated with maybe a big major league team. But it's kind of interesting that we see this puzzle going on. So I wanted to make sure we mentioned it there. So with all this kind of discussion, what we really want to focus on here is how revenue sharing is going to impact our league, right? So all these revenue sources, we can't do anything about the fact that a large market team is able to earn much higher amounts at the gate or much higher naming rights or local broadcast deals. Yeah, that's going to happen, right? They just face a higher demand curve. But we can try to use this revenue sharing to alleviate that problem, okay? So I've got a bunch of things here, but about what they actually did with revenue sharing. We want to skip ahead a little bit. So try a new incognito. Oh, thanks. So we'll come back to it. I think I'll revisit it next class and dive into that paper a little bit, as well as the one I put up there for us to read. So let's go here. And I want to think about what revenue sharing is going to do. So once this gets up here, hopefully, well, it's hard to see again, isn't it? See if I can get it to focus on this marker a little bit better. Let me know if this is too high. We'll see. If you can't make anything out, I don't think this is quite as clear as the other day, but let me know and I'll try to kind of give some verbal for what it is as well. So we've got, we're thinking about the number of wins over here on my x-axis. And if we really want to put it, we've got dollar signs on my y-axis here. So this, okay. So let's assume that we have two teams that face the same constant marginal cost, right? This is how we set up identifying the difference between win and profit maximizing. So initially, we said, what if there is a large market team? So we'll call this the demand for the large market team. And they have monopoly power, so they have this marginal revenue curve as well. Okay. Let's start out with a scenario where both teams are profit maximizing, okay? So if they're both profit maximizing, they'll choose the optimal number of wins where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, right? That's their profit maximizing number of wins. Okay? So that's our large market team. We know that a small market team faces a lower demand curve. I'm doing this in different colors. I might end up just doing them all in black because it looks like this isn't going to come up quite as nice for us. And there should be, let me see. I might play around with this here. I think that just completely washes it out. So here we've got the demand for the small market team. So we'll call that kind of D subscript S there. And then the marginal revenue curve for the small market team is right here. So their optimal number of wins, their profit maximizing, right here. Okay? So we've got these differences in small and large market teams, and they're both profit maximizing. Let's assume now the league does some type of revenue sharing, right? To kind of keep it easy, we'll think about it as 50%, right? So if it's 50%, right, let's think about how that would impact just one team, okay? And then we'll kind of come back to thinking about this scenario where we have two. So let's just think about the effects that it's going to have on one team. So got the number of wins down here, constant marginal cost. Let's think about here we've got demand for large, marginal revenue for large. If I revenue share, I take a certain percent, say 50%, let's say I do it across every type of revenue for that team. Right? It's going to shift my demand curve back because now essentially every time I sell a unit, or every time I shouldn't say sell a unit, every time I win an additional game, I don't earn whatever that revenue is, I only earn 50% of it. Right? So what we're really thinking about there is we see this decrease in our demand curve. So we'll kind of call that DL, little kind of apostrophe up there. And then the marginal revenue, obviously, if it's half demand, that would fall as well. Right? So if we think about what this revenue sharing has done to a profit maximizing team, right? The large market team, we'll call this the optimal, kind of where we originally started, that optimal number of wins. So now marginal cost, just a reminder, this is our marginal cost curve. Now our optimal number of wins is kind of much smaller, right? And it kind of makes sense just intuitively. The incentive to win is to earn this additional revenue, but now if I can only keep half of that, it's not as strong as an incentive. It's the same idea of, if I'm gonna pay you $10 to work, you might work a few more hours, right? You're gonna target a higher number of hours than if I'm only paying you $5 per hour, right? If I'm only paying you half that, okay? It's the same sort of principle going on here with teams, right? These additional wins just aren't worth as much to them now, right? Because I'm taking half of their revenue. Now, before, and I know that I did something with this last class, we said we could think about the demand curve as average total revenue. And the reason behind that was we had like, price times quantity would be total revenue, divided by quantity would give us average total revenue. Well, these cancel. We could think about, remember, our demand equation is price is equal to some function of quantity. And so really our demand equation was the average total revenue with this linear demand curve. But now, with revenue sharing, right, the league initially takes half of every single team's money, but then what do? Once they pool it all together, they give it all back out equally, right? So now what happens is, I can think about what is my total revenue after revenue sharing? Well, it's going to be kind of price times quantity. Now here we can think about really quantity is wins, but I'm just going to keep it as price and quantity because we're probably more familiar with thinking about it that way. I'm then going to have this additional component, which is however much money the league gives back to me, right? Whatever that revenue sharing amount the league gives out, once it's collected all of it, how much it gives out to each team. It gives an equal amount to each team. So now when I think about my average total revenue, I have to divide total revenue by quantity. Well, right, this is going to be kind of my new demand curve after I have the revenue sharing. But I'm also going to have this component now where I can't cancel it out, which is essentially that as I win a higher number of games or the quantity goes up, that revenue sharing, the average total revenue, is going to start kind of falling. Right? The revenue sharing amount stays the same. So if I divide it by 1, let's say the league gives me 50 million. Well, the average total revenue then for my first win is 50 million over 1. But what about when I win 10 games? Well, now it's 50 million over 10, right? Because that revenue sharing amount doesn't depend on how many games I win. I get it regardless, right? So what happens is on this new demand curve that I now face because of the revenue sharing, wherever it hits this point kind of down here on the axis would be where our average total revenue curve kind of starts. And it doesn't bend backwards here. I'm just bad at drawing. So this should kind of be like here instead. But this idea is we have this average total revenue curve that, right, is actually dependent on the number of wins, the quantity, the number of wins that I have. Okay? And it will be identical to my demand curve once I get to kind of that highest number of wins. Okay? Or sorry, think about this different. My average total revenue curve and demand curve will be 0 at the axis. Okay? So now, if I think about before, we said, what if so getting ahead of myself. So in this scenario, if they're profit maximizing, what happens? Well, marginal revenue equals marginal cost here. Nothing's changed, right? The issue is once I have this average total revenue curve, when we go back to thinking about where our profits equal to 0, okay? Well, now profits aren't equal to 0 at this point. We said last class, with this setup, where demand intersects marginal cost, that's where profits were equal to 0. That's where a team would win maximize, right? So if we're thinking about the differences here, I won't draw another graph, but if they were win maximizing before, we thought they were at this point. This is where profits were equal to 0. The issue is now, my revenue is not just solely based off of that demand curve. It also has this additional revenue sharing component. So now profits are actually equal to 0 out where the marginal cost intersects my average total revenue curve. Okay? So the optimal number of wins for these large market teams, if they're win maximizing, is actually going to be out to where that average total revenue curve is. Okay? So that's kind of another wrinkle that this revenue sharing kind of throws at us. It not only shifts our demand and marginal revenue curve, which leads to kind of a lower number of targeted wins if I'm profit maximizing. Well, it'll still lead to a smaller number of additional wins if I'm win maximizing. It's just I don't identify that win maximizing point where the demand curve hits marginal cost. It's now going to be where my average total revenue curve intersects my marginal cost, because that average total revenue curve factors in this revenue sharing amount that I'm getting from the lead. Okay. Any questions on that? And here let me see if I can give a, let's think about average total profits for a second. Not on the screen. Average total profits. This isn't really, I'm not sure if I've ever written this in a class before, but it kind of gives us a nice idea to think about average total profits, right? So profits are going to be total revenue minus total cost, and to get the average, we would just divide by quantity, right? So we're thinking about what is our total revenue, price times quantity, plus this, we'll call it RS, revenue sharing. My total costs, well, if I have constant marginal cost, it's just that marginal cost amount times however many I sell. Right? And I can think about, I can divide by quantity here. But if I start to kind of pull things out, I can actually rewrite this. Make sure this is all on the same screen. I can actually think about kind of removing quantity so that it's my profits are equal to 0, or this average total profit is equal to 0 when price minus my marginal cost times quantity plus that revenue sharing. Right. Well, the Q gets dropped out. I then think about, well, when does this equal to 0? It's no longer when price is equal to marginal cost, or kind of where I'm at in that demand curve, which is what we had before. Now it's equal to 0 when this entire kind of equation is equal to, it's now equal to 0 when this entire numerator that we had is equal to 0. So it's now going to be at a point that's slightly higher because I now have this additional revenue component, okay? So that's why the new kind of profit is equal to 0 point is out where that average total revenue curve hits our marginal cost curve. Okay. Questions on that? So if they're both profit maximizing, right, why could this revenue sharing help improve competitive balance, or help improve kind of that, decrease that difference between the number of targeted wins from the number of targeted wins from a large market team versus the number of targeted wins from a small market team? Okay. So that's what we're going to think about next. We've thought about how to identify the new win maximizing point after revenue sharing, but now we want to think about how does this revenue sharing help improve that difference between the targeted number of wins for large and small market teams. So if they were both profit maximizing, we started out with this scenario. If I now do a 50% revenue share, what's going to happen to both teams' demand curves? They're going to essentially be cut in half, right? So if they're both profit maximizing, you might think, well, both are going to be cut in half. We're just going to kind of shift both these backwards. They'll be the same distance apart. Right? But if we think about the shift that we're going to see, let's say, we can't put a number to this demand curve, but to kind of understand the shift that's going to occur, let's say before, whatever our optimal number of wins were, we were at, I don't know, we could put this into dollars. So 50 and $100, right? For that last win I was targeting, my marginal revenue, say for the small market team, was $50. And at that last optimal win, kind of the marginal revenue, or sorry, I don't want to do it this way. I'm going to try to explain it to you a slightly different way, although I think the way I drew this, it may not be very easy to do. It's not going to be easy to do. Well, hang with me for a second. So this might get a little bit murky, but if we could quantify the demand curve, right? How high it was at, obviously at different points in the demand curves are going to be at different locations. But let's say we could quantify them into two numbers. If I then take half of that from each team, right? So the difference here is what? We think about kind of the difference between the two. The difference is 50. Right? If I cut both of these in half, right? What's the new difference between the two? So I've actually drawn them closer together because 50% of the small market team's revenue is a much smaller amount than 50% of the large market team's revenue. So even if we're profit maximizing, we're both going to still choose where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. We know that after revenue sharing, the shift we see in the large market teams is going to be a larger downward shift than the downward shift we see for small market teams. You know, and I could draw both of these on here, but that's really the idea, is that you're going to see a larger shift for a team that has a higher demand curve than you will for the team that has the smaller demand curve. And so even without, even if we don't factor in win, neither team is win maximizing, they're both profit maximizing, because that shift in the large market team is going to be larger, we'll draw those optimal number of wins closer together. Okay. How much time do I left? Okay, I'll go over one more thing. So I think the other thing that I wanted to try to go through, so we've got profit maximizing, we discussed, how just revenue sharing will draw those closer together. We talked about how to identify the new win maximizing point. We could also see a scenario where, so let's say I've got, same thing, we're always going to do kind of the same marginal cost for these two teams. But now, let's say we have kind of a small market team, right? And it could be, so we could start to think about different scenarios. So here was the demand for the small market team and their initial marginal revenue, right? Let's say they were win maximizing, right? So they're at this point where they're kind of win maximizing, okay? So this is before revenue sharing, okay? After the revenue sharing, right, they're going to see a decrease in their demand curve, okay? So let's say, I'm going to try to get this drawn. Let's say it doesn't shift a ton for the sake of being able to show you this. And we got our new marginal revenue curve as well. So kind of put those little dashes there. I see that okay? Or have any questions on that? So just identifying the new marginal revenue demand curve. We saw, I don't know what percent this is, maybe 10% or something. Well, for the small market team, 10% of, and let's say we, 10% of whatever the, let's do it was the local broadcast deals. Well, they hardly even had any, right? So they saw almost no shift in their demand curve. But what could they have seen kind of a lot of additional money from revenue sharing? Well, let's say this one team is the only small market team. Every other team is in a large market earning tons of money off their local broadcast deals. So once all that money goes to the league and they hand it back out, well, now you kind of think about, there was this, the way I drew it was not quite right. I wanted to get it so that it's somewhere over here. So that now we think about where's the win maximizing point. Well, it's not where the demand curve hits marginal cost. It's where this new average total revenue curve hits marginal cost. And theoretically, it could be slightly higher. The new number of wins, we'll call this star star, right? It could be slightly higher than it was before, right? And if I had left myself a little bit more room, I could have actually shown, you know, maybe we see a huge amount of revenue sharing coming from the league from these other large market teams. And so my average total, revenue curve could be way out here. So theoretically, we could end up with a scenario where if I'm paying in less than I'm receiving, which for these small market teams towards the bottom is likely going to be the scenario, if I'm win maximizing, potentially this revenue sharing, you know, not forces me, but a byproduct of this revenue sharing is that I'm actually, if I'm win maximizing, I'll target a higher number of wins as a small market team after this revenue sharing, right? And this is what the league hopes, right? The league hopes this is what happens, okay? Because they know that for a large market team, they're going to see a much larger shift in their demand curve. They're likely going to be paying more in than they're receiving. And so for a large market team, it's not possible that their average total revenue curve is going to kind of intersect the marginal cost curve at a point past what the team was targeting before. Right? So this is what the league hopes, that because the small market teams aren't impacted very, very much, but they'll receive a lot of additional revenue, that perhaps they'll target a higher number of wins. Okay? Any questions on that? I know I kind of messed up this line at first. I think I was thinking I could draw it and show you that the number of wins was exactly the same, but really there is this, I want to show this idea that it is possible that they actually end up targeting a higher number of wins. Okay. Any questions on that? I should go back, make sure there's nothing in the chat here. Okay. Trying to make sure this is straight too. Let's think about a little bit of time. So here was a win maximizing team, right? What happens if this small market team was instead profit maximizing? What's going to happen to the optimal number of wins? So the black was where we were at before. So where would the optimal number of wins been if they were profit maximizing? It would be where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. Okay. Anytime we're thinking about profit maximizing, no matter what model we're looking at, where does marginal cost equal marginal revenue? Win maximizing is a different story, right? Because there we're just trying to deplete our profits. So we would have been out at this point. What happened after revenue sharing? We chose this point. So if we simply, and I kind of said that earlier in one of the other graphs I drew, but if we're profit maximizing, this revenue sharing guarantees I will see a reduction in my targeted number of optimal wins. Right? The only real time that this is going to be a benefit is if I'm win maximizing. Okay? This is a good kind of example of what do you think these profit maximizing small market teams do once revenue sharing is enacted? What do they do with the additional money that the team gives back to them? If I'm profit maximizing and I'm just given a bunch of additional money by the team, I'm just going to hold on to it. Yeah, right? Because it doesn't matter if I win 0 games or every single game in the season. I keep that revenue sharing amount. And if I'm profit maximizing, I'm just trying to I'm trying to maximize my profits. So why increase my cost to win more games when I have this revenue sharing amount that's not tied to how many games I win at all, right? So if we have a lot of profit maximizing teams, revenue sharing can actually have some detrimental effects on my league, because now the small market teams are going to target an even smaller number of games, right? They're just going to hold on to the rest of it as profits, right? So what you really hope for with revenue sharing is that your small market teams are going to be these win maximizers. And then what do you hope for your large market teams? Well, you hope that your large market teams are profit maximizers, because you know if they are, then revenue sharing, they'll target a smaller number of wins. But if your small market teams are win maximizers, they'll target a higher number. You've drawn those closer together. You have a more competitive league, right? So that's what the league is hoping, that large market teams are profit maximizers Small market teams are going to be these win maximizers. Okay? And we'll start next class. We'll go through some of the slides I skipped, but we'll also kind of revisit this and think about different combinations of profit versus win maximizing and how revenue sharing could look a little bit different as well. Okay? Any questions before we get out of here for the day? All right, I will see you guys on Thursday. We'll do some more revenue sharing, and that will be really important for one of the questions on that homework that I'll post when I get back to my office today, as well as an online quiz that's due before class on Thursday. Okay? All right, we'll see you guys on Thursday. Stay warm.